The beaches were never meant to hold this many men. They stretched in both directions, mile after mile of sand and shingle, under a wide, pale sky that smelled of salt and smoke. The tide moved lazily, as if it didn't understand the urgency pressing in on the men stranded here. Behind them, the town of Dunkirk burned in pieces, brick walls sagging inward, church spires split open by shell fire, the streets tangled with rubble. Ahead of them, the English Channel glimmered in the morning light, the only way home. It was late May 1940, and the Allied army in France was cornered. The German blitzkrieg had ripped through Belgium and northern France with stunning speed, cutting the British Expeditionary Force, along with French and Belgian units, off from the rest of the Allied front. The retreat had been relentless, village to village, hedgerow to hedgerow, until the only ground left was the narrow strip between the sea and the German line. Nearly 400,000 men were trapped here. They could fight and die, surrender and disappear into German prison camps, or they could somehow escape across the water. The port of Dunkirk, their only real exit, was already under heavy bombardment. The harbor facilities were smashed, the quays were broken teeth. Large warships could only pick up so many at a time. The beaches were shallow, the water too thin for big transports to come close. From the German side, artillery ranged the shore, and Luftwaffe bombers prowled overhead. Every few minutes, the scream of diving Stukas sent men running for the shallows or throwing themselves into the sand. Still, the order went out from London. Every vessel that could carry a man was to head for Dunkirk. Naval destroyers, troop ships, fishing smacks, pleasure yachts, lifeboats, anything that could float and move under its own power. The call was desperate, and desperate calls have a way of being answered. The men on the beaches heard the first rumors in disbelief. They're sending fishing boats, paddle steamers, yachts from the Thames. It sounded like madness. But on May 26th, 1940, Operation Dynamo began, and by the end of that day, the madness was real. The first attempts were slow. Destroyers edged in where they could, taking soldiers directly from the East Mole, a long breakwater still standing against the sea. Others waded out to motor launches and were ferried to larger ships waiting offshore. The process was awkward, dangerous, and under constant fire. On May 27th, heavy air raids sank several ships and littered the water with burning wreckage. Yet something unexpected happened. Civilian craft, manned by naval reservists or the owners themselves, began appearing out of the haze. A coal barge from Folkestone, a river launch from the Thames, a pleasure yacht with bunting still hanging from its mast. They wove among the bigger ships, edging into the surf to pull men directly from the shallows. The soldiers clambered aboard, boots squelching on the decks, their faces a mixture of exhaustion and disbelief. The German army was tightening its grip. Armored divisions stood only a few miles inland, held back for the moment by Hitler's controversial halt order, which paused the final assault to let the Luftwaffe finish the job. That pause was the thin margin the Allies needed. Every hour it lasted meant more men off the beaches. On May 28th, the weather turned in the Allies' favor. Low clouds and mist grounded much of the German Air Force. The evacuation surged. Lines of men stood waist-deep in the surf, rifles slung across their backs, waiting for their turn. Naval ratings shouted orders over the wind, and small craft darted in to load them by the dozen. Destroyers, crowded to the gunwales, roared back toward England with decks crammed shoulder to shoulder. A few miles offshore, hospital ships took on the wounded, their white paint and red crosses barely protection against strafing runs. The civilian volunteers became the lifeblood of the operation. Some were experienced sailors. Others had never crossed the channel before. They navigated through minefields, dodged wrecks, and endured bombing raids that sent water spouting 30 feet in the air around them. Many made multiple trips, ferrying men from the beach to larger ships or all the way to English ports. Some were sunk in the effort. Survivors simply found another boat and returned. The men waiting on the beach endured their own kind of trial. The sand offered no cover. Bombs fell in clusters, tossing up geysers of earth and water. Machine gun fire from passing aircraft stitched across the shallows, cutting down men mid-step. At night, the sky glowed with burning oil tanks and the flashes of distant artillery. Food and water were scarce. Discipline and morale were stretched thin. Yet order held. Units queued in columns, each man knowing that chaos would cost lives. By May 30th, the evacuation was working at a pace no one had dared hope for. Hundreds of ships, large and small, were shuttling back and forth. The East Mole, miraculously still usable, served as a vital loading point for destroyers and troopships. Soldiers marched along its narrow walkway, under the crack of nearby gunfire, stepping aboard as quickly as they could. The Germans pressed harder. Artillery crept closer to the shore. The Luftwaffe returned in strength, sinking ships almost within sight of England. But the tide of men kept flowing outward. By June 1st, the British rearguard, units of infantry, engineers, and French troops, were fighting bitterly to hold the shrinking perimeter while their comrades escaped. The final days were the hardest. German guns could reach nearly every part of the beach. The wreckage of ships littered the shallows, forcing boats to weave among twisted steel and floating debris. Fires burned unchecked in the town. The rearguard fought house to house as the evacuation points dwindled. On June 4th, the last ships departed. The rearguard, mostly French troops, were captured that day, but Operation Dynamo had defied every expectation. Of the nearly 400,000 trapped in Dunkirk, over 338,000 had been brought to England. The numbers were staggering, but they told only part of the story. For the men who had stood on that beach, the memory was of waiting under the scream of bombs, of seeing a fishing boat's bow push through the haze, of clambering aboard something far smaller than the ship they'd expected, and of turning to watch France recede into the mist. For the civilians who had answered the call, it was the knowledge that their small craft had carried not just men, but a piece of a nation's survival. Dunkirk was not a victory in the usual sense. The British Expeditionary Force had left behind nearly all its equipment, tanks, guns, vehicles, on the beaches. France would fall within weeks. But the evacuation preserved the core of Britain's army, making it possible to fight on. It became a symbol that in the face of disaster, an entire nation could rise, not just its soldiers, but its fishermen, its yachtsmen, its everyday citizens. Today, the beaches at Dunkirk are quiet. The sand stretches in the same long arc. The channel still shimmers under the sun. But stand there long enough, and you can almost hear the rumble of engines beyond the haze, see the shapes of small boats coming in through the surf, and hear the voices shouting over the wind. Get aboard! Quickly now! Thank you for listening to Last Post History. Subscribe for more true stories from the world at war.